Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day. Welcome to the CES Letters podcast. My name is Easton. I'm joined here today with our good friend and brother, Stephen C. Harper. Steve Harper, most of you will have known him at this point. We've done a lot of different interviews with him, but he's a scholar in the church. He knows better than he knows much more about these things than just about anybody we can get. Steve Harper was an editor on the Joseph Smith papers. He was a historian over the Saints project, just book one, right? Or all of the books?
Yeah, we worked on all of them simultaneously, but as soon as volume one was out, that job for me was done, and Jed Woodworth took over. He knows a lot more about the whole broad picture than I do. Very cool.
Well, Steve Harper is an expert when it comes to these things, but today we'll be talking specifically about the Priesthood Restoration. So without further ado, I present to you the Priesthood Restoration with Dr. Stephen C. Harper. All right, Steve, how are you doing today?
Great, Easton. How are you?
I'm doing very good. Thank you very much. Number one, I'm super hyped about this episode today. This is a topic that I feel like I've been able to personally study more than most of the other topics that we've talked about. So that makes me a little bit excited. Before we get started, though, as always, I just want a little icebreaker question for our listeners. What is something about you that most people don't know? Just like a fun or interesting fact.
I was thinking about this on the way over, thinking you might do this to me again. And I am pretty lame. Let's see. Okay, here is something about me that I probably haven't told many, if any, people. And that is that I sometimes daydream about writing a novel, and I would be awful at it if I tried to do it.
Sure.
But I have this idea in my head that I think is the most brilliant possible idea for a novel, but I don't dare to actually execute it. My mom used to say, you ought to write books, church history books like Gerald Lund's Work in the Glory series.
Right.
My mom and sisters devoured those and learned a lot from them. And I used to sort of protest, like, I don't have that gift. I can't do it that way. So I sort of aspire to, in a way, but I think that's probably not my genre.
Hey, you helped with the Saints books, and those feel like a novel in many ways.
Yeah, that's not my fault, though. That is, thank heavens, to
the other
to a
team
whole
of
bunch
people.
of other really, really talented people. Yes, indeed.
Very cool. Well, I would wholeheartedly support, but I'd be the first in line to buy that book whenever you get to it.
All right.
Steve, the other thing I want to many people probably know this as well, but I think it's important. We've grown a lot over the past couple of weeks. So I think for our new listeners, I think it's important. Could you give us just a little bit of your background? How did you go from being just a normal guy to being a seeker of truth and becoming a PhD in American history?
Well, I usually start that story with me at 14 years old. That's the first time in my life I can remember being serious, having a serious question about a church history question. It was in the middle, although no one knew it at the time, of the Mark Hoffman forgery scandal. The Church News in May of 1985 published what purported to be the earliest known letter Joseph Smith had ever composed. It was a letter from Joseph to Josiah Stowell, his employer or to-be employer. And it explained how Joseph would use his gift of seeing to divine the location of buried treasure, or Joseph telling Stowell how it could be done. And it perplexed me a little, worried me. I asked my dad about it. He did such an excellent job of helping me, first of all, taking me very, very seriously, and helping me understand what I knew and what I didn't know, and what I could know and what I couldn't know, at least right then. He essentially taught me then and there how to seek. He did an excellent job of setting me on a course. And, it'd be several years before I would become serious about that. But as a missionary, I realized that I wanted to seek the truth more than anything else. And so I came home from my mission, changed my major in college. I started in ancient Near Eastern studies and did not succeed well at that. But in the meantime, became just intoxicated by the Lord's revelations to Joseph Smith. And I've been studying them and the historical record around them intensively for about 3 decades.
It's very impressive. With that, what would your advice be to somebody who's wanting to learn as much as you do, and you have basically the whole Doctrine and Covenants memorized? What would you recommend to those type of people?
Well, they need to, first of all, learn what they know and how they know it, and what they don't yet know. And of course, the saying is true: you don't know how much you don't know. You got to start asking questions, and they should be seeking questions, right? Seeking questions do not presume the answer. There are a lot of declarative questions in stuff like the CES letter and other things. In fact, it's a great example of declarative questions. It's driven not by a sincere desire to know the truth. More and more evidence is coming out that it was contrived all along as a facade, right? A representation of a sincere seeker who didn't really have any interest. Now, there are a lot of sincere seekers out there, many of whom are influenced by the CES letter. And
many who have very similar questions that are posed in the CES letter.
Indeed. So we want to take them very seriously. And we take the CES letter, or have, at face value. And because largely we know there are many, many people who do at face value have the questions that are in it. So the first thing they need to do is to slow down their thinking. You can't read something like the CES letter or listen to this one episode or anything else like it and then know stuff. You're just tipping the iceberg. And what you need to do, if you want to know the foundations of the restoration, you have to get to the raw materials of knowledge. You have to get to the sources of the knowledge. So if God called Joseph Smith, well, then the very best sources of that knowledge are Joseph Smith's records of it. And you have to come to know them for yourself. There are thousands of people, maybe not thousands, but hundreds, myself included, are going to tell you what you should think about them. A real seeker will not be satisfied with that. They might start there, but only to get access to the real stuff, to the raw material. And they won't want anybody mediating between them and God. They'll want to read the sources for themselves, and they'll want to seek revelation from God to know if they're true. And so I get delighted when I hear people manifesting, or see people manifesting that spirit, that desire, that sincere will to seek the truth for themselves. And it frustrates me when you see people who really are not interested. They say they're interested in seeking the truth, but they're not. You can tell they're not because they stop at CES letter or anything like it. And so there's no way you could get me to just read Grant Palmer's book or something and then stop there and think I knew something, right? You take a book like that and you take it apart. You dismantle it. You check every sentence and you decide, is this a fact? Is this a verifiable fact that's the same no matter what your perspective is? Or is this an interpretation? Is it an assumption? There are terrific sites that actually do that. Now, again, I wouldn't end with them. I'd start with them. Seekers have to learn that skill. They have to gain that ability to discern the truth. And people who read a little and think they know something, they just don't know how much they don't know. Right.
And I think that's one of the important things that we're trying to do here. We talk about a lot, Daniel Kahneman's book of slowing down, but recognizing, what do you know? What do we think we know? What do we don't know that we don't know, all of that. And lots of this stuff, I think a lot of people don't know what they don't know. And then they read the CES letter, they come across other things, and it's a little bit, it causes a lot of dissonance for them. Yeah. So that's what we're just trying to do here. As we get started, another thing I want to just give a shout out to is this is one of a handful of episodes we're going to be doing on the priesthood and priesthood restoration. We'll have a couple other episodes specifically about priesthood restoration. Barbara Morgan Gardner is going to come on and talk about women in the priesthood.
Excellent.
So there's multiple facets to this, and this will just kind of be a great, I think, overview to the rest of the stuff we'll talk about. As we get started, I want to kind of go over the timeline of priesthood, and this is coming from the church's website. So they point out first that Jesus Christ and his apostles had the priesthood. When he died, priesthood authority was taken off of the earth. In the early 1800s, Joseph Smith, Jesus Christ began the restoration through the prophet Joseph Smith, which included the restoration of the priesthood. And then this is a direct quote. It says, while Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were working on the translation of the Book of Mormon, they read about baptism on May 18th, 1829.
15th.
May 15th, 1829. They went to a wooded area near Joseph Smith's home in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and prayed about what they had learned. This then turned into John the Baptist under the direction of Jesus Christ, appearing, and he conferred upon them the Aaronic priesthood. After this, Joseph and Oliver were then baptized and then ordained each other to the Aaronic priesthood. So I think let's start there, and we can kind of move on from there to the Melchizedek priesthood and additional priesthood keys. But one question I have before we dive into specifics is John the Baptist comes, he confers them the Aaronic priesthood, but then they get baptized and then they are ordained. What's the difference between that ordination and?
I don't know, but one possibility is practice, right? John is, among other things, he's commissioning priests for this new restoration of the gospel. And so one possibility is that he gives them authority to do what he's going to instruct them to do, and then instructs them to do it. So Joseph and Oliver have never done this before. They've never baptized anyone. They've never ordained anyone. Well, they're going to be baptizing and ordaining a lot of people. One possibility is John is doing some leadership training here. I don't know if that's the right answer or not. I like asking that kind of question and then thinking about possibilities. Notice that I said I don't know because we don't know. There is no historical material. Joseph and Oliver didn't leave us an explicit answer to that question. They were very explicit about, on the 15th day of May, near the Susquehanna River, John the Baptist ordained us to the priesthood, right? The priesthood of Aaron. And they explicitly talked about the keys that it holds and what John's commission entailed. But they didn't answer the why do we do it this way? And it's a question that should be asked with sincere interest, but sometimes people ask it as if it's a proof of insincerity or that it never really happened. Well, if they really got ordained by John the Baptist, they wouldn't have then ordained each other, right? Well, that's
an assumption.
How does that person know? Right? I'll tell you who knows whether they got ordained by John the Baptist. Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. They're the only ones who know. And you and I will only know through them. Or we'll have to read what they wrote about it or said about it. And then for us to really know whether that's true, we'll have to have a confirmation from God. Anybody who's not got that pair of experiences, they don't know. They don't know whether Joseph was ordained by John the Baptist or not.
Right.
So he said he was. He said this is the order of events. He didn't say why it was the order of events, but I can be confident that he's telling the truth and not presume to know why exactly John had him do it that way.
Right. So was this history of these events taking place, was it written in a journal or was it written after the fact? What kind of is that order of events?
Joseph Smith does not start keeping a journal until November 1832. So this happens on May 15th, 1829.
Right.
It'll be 3.5 years before Joseph will begin keeping a journal. And when he does, it's entries about his daily experience. And it is rough. His first entry is sort of a few lines, then he scratches most of it out. He's not a writer. It's a struggle for him. And he does that for 10 days and then he quits for 10 months. Now,
that sounds like me on my
me
mission.
too. Yeah, me too. By 1835, Joseph's got a scribe writing for him. And this scribe keeps his journal. Now, when Joseph has a visitor come from New York City and sort of inquire about the restoration, Joseph tells him, and this is a spontaneous memory. Joseph's not strategizing about how will I tell this story in my written account.
Right.
When Joseph spontaneously remembers stuff, it's easier for him. It's a stream of consciousness. He doesn't have to worry about the sentences. And so he tells this story, and he tells the forthcoming of the Book of Mormon, and he starts it with his first vision and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. That's how his journal works. In other words, there are not journal entries where he, in his own handwriting, recounts the reception of ministering angels and the priesthoods. But there are rare spots in his journals where someone else captures what he's saying. So the other kind of record we have is an autobiography. Now, at the same time he starts this journal, or around the same time, he composes, along with Frederick Williams, an autobiography that's 6 pages long. It, again, is a pretty rough literary product. It starts with a half a page of really triumphant declarations, a history of the life of Joseph Smith and of all the marvelous things that Jesus Christ has done through him. First, the testimony from on high. Second, the ministering of angels. Third, the reception of the priesthood by ministering angels. And fourth, the confirmation of the high priesthood by ministering angels. So this is our earliest document that declares that Joseph Smith has been ordained to priesthood, 2 priesthoods, by ministering angels. It does not use the words Aaronic and Melchizedek. Right. Joseph will start to use those terms by the mid-1830s, but not before then. So I hope that answers your question. We do have journals. We have 1,500 plus pages of Joseph Smith's journals. But they typically say, this is what I did today. Or if Joseph's writing the entry, they typically say, this is what I was thinking about today. This is the prayer I offered today. Rarely do they narrate historical events, but they do occasionally. He also writes memoirs or autobiographies. The one that's best known is the one that's excerpted in The Pearl of Great Price. Right. It's the one we've been using to tell the story of John the Baptist. And those records are our sources for priesthood restoration. They have gaps. For example, in the manuscript history, the one excerpted in the Pearl of Great Price, there's no narrative of Joseph being ordained an apostle or to the Melchizedek priesthood by Peter, James, and John. We don't know of any narrative from Oliver on that either. Both of them are in the historical record repeatedly mentioning that happens, but neither one of them are known to have left us the story of what happened there.
Right. And we're going to talk about that here in about 23 seconds. I guess, is there anything else you think we should understand about the Aaronic priesthood? I think that covers most of the questions that I've seen, but... the thing I guess I want to emphasize is it is so easy to tell that story and be kind of nonchalant about it. Joseph Smith himself is, in his manuscript history, visited by an angel. He said his name was John, the same as called John the Baptist. It's matter of fact. It's very straightforward. He said he was under the direction of Peter, James, and John. He ordained us. He said these words. It was on the 15th of May, 1829. You can kind of get lulled to, ease. Like, this happens every day. Right. It's not that big of a deal.
Yeah. This does not happen every day. Right. This is unbelievably cool.
Yeah, when was the last time you saw John the Baptist,
Not
Steve?
for, I can't remember.
Been a while?
Yeah. Been a minute? Is a hot minute?
A
Is
hot
that
minute.
what
That's what we say nowadays.
Okay. So, John the Baptist, everybody knows who he is. He got beheaded, right? He's now standing in the Pennsylvania woods, and he is resurrected. And he ordains Joseph and Oliver, the man who baptized Jesus Christ, the ultimate Aaronic priest of all history. And notice what this does. This testifies of the need for a restoration, right? Well, do we really need a restoration or not? This is the sticking point between the restored gospel and the unrestored gospel, and the restored Church of Jesus Christ and the unrestored versions of Christianity. Well, was there really a gap in authority? Do we really need an angel to come and restore it? Yes is the testimony of this history of Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith. If John the Baptist appeared to them in the Pennsylvania woods, then we need a restoration of authority by an angel. And so it's a hugely important event, and one that we don't want to gloss over too easily or take too much for granted.
Right. The one last final question I have about the Aaronic priesthood, and I don't know if this is that big of a question, but for many people, so they're conferred the priesthood by John the Baptist. Are they automatically made priests? Did they just skip deacon teacher, or did they even hold an office of the priesthood? Or?
This is another excellent question to which we don't have an answer.
Okay,
now, that doesn't mean there aren't 50 people out there answering it, pretending to know or think they know something.
Right.
We don't know.
Okay.
So I said priest in a loose way, a priest as someone who mediates between God and people.
Right.
A priest is someone who baptizes. So I don't know whether John specifically says, now there are offices in this priesthood, and Joseph doesn't give us any indication that he knows about deacons or teachers for several years after that. They're not in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
So D&C 20 will eventually include deacons and teachers, but not even in its first iteration. Those offices are revealed and added later.
Makes sense. So I now want to read just a little quote from the CES letter itself.
Okay.
This has to do with both Aaronic and Melchizedek, and I think it'll be kind of a good transition into Melchizedek priesthood. Jeremy Reynolds in the CES letter, he says, like the first vision story, none of the members of the church or Joseph Smith's family had ever heard prior to 1832 about a priesthood restoration from John the Baptist or Peter, James, and John. Mm-hmm. Although the priesthood is now taught to have been restored in 1829, Joseph and Oliver made no such claim until 1832, if that. Even in 1832, there were no claims of a restoration of the priesthood, just a reception of the priesthood, and there certainly was no specific claims of John the Baptist, Peter, James, or John. Like the first vision accounts, the story later got more elaborate and bold with specific claims of miraculous visitations from resurrected John the Baptist, Peter, James, and John. He then quotes, and this is a little bit before, he quotes our good friend Richard Bushman, and he says, Richard Bushman says, the late appearance of these accounts raises the possibility of later fabrication, close quote. Where would you go from here?
Wow.
There's a lot there that we can go into.
Yeah, so one thing that bugs me a lot is when a person presumes to know everything about the past based on the 3 or 4 puzzle pieces they have. So notice that it says, no member of the Smith family ever did this or that. Right. How in the world do you know that? Mm-hmm. All you know is what the historical records say. So he's got to learn to be more modest. He's got to slow down. And I use him sort of as our archetype here, right?
Right.
Anybody in this boat, you got to learn to slow down. The CES letter does not know what Joseph knew, what his family knew. All it knows is that there are these historical records that exist. And it is a terrible assumption to think that the few historical records I have tell everything everybody ever knew. And as soon as I read those historical records, I now know everything everybody knew and said and did and thought from 1820 to 1830 or whatever.
Right.
That is not true. And so he's practicing a method that's just dreadfully calculated to give him the idea that he knows so much more than what he knows.
Right.
Richard Bushman does not do that. And by the way, I'm guessing that quote of Bushman.
I'm trying to pull up the whole quote. I'm trying to pull up the whole quote as we speak.
Yeah, that's just Bushman setting up a problem that he's going to discuss and unpack. And that's a cherry picking way to pick a line from Bushman that makes it sound like he's doubting when what he's really doing is raising an issue that he's about to discuss.
Right. And I have found the quote in Richard Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling, and it is in the very middle of a very long paragraph, very, very long paragraph. And the very next sentence, I think, is notable. The sentence Jeremy took was, the late appearance of these accounts raises the possibility of later fabrication. Richard Bushman, though, in this exact same paragraph, he says, if so, he made little of the occurrence. Cowdery was the first to recount the story of John's appearance, not Joseph himself. When Joseph described John's visit, he was much more plain-spoken. Moreover, he inserted the story into a history composed in 1838, but not published until 1842. If circulated without fanfare, must, like a refurbished memory, than a triumphant announcement. Another thing is our friend Robert Millett, he has a great book about the Restoration, and he points out that sure, maybe it wasn't specifically written about, but when it was finally written about, it was very much matter of the fact of, we all know this already, so why am I even writing this down almost? So just because it's not written down in any book doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Yeah,
I'm not writing down my daily events, but when I talk to my mom, I'm not treating them all like new events. I'm just
So if we were to treat your life the way we treat the way CES Letter treats it, we would say that if it's not in your daily texts or emails or journal, it didn't happen.
Right. And
if all of your relatives are not saying, today Easton, did a somersault, then you didn't. Right. So I really appreciate that you let Bushman speak for himself, because he was way misrepresented in that passage.
And I will say, we interviewed Richard Bushman just recently, and I'm not sure what the order of episodes being released with that is, though. But Richard Bushman, one of the things him and I talked about, I'm not sure if it was in the interview itself or before or after, but one of the questions that one of our Instagram friends said was, what would Richard Bushman's response be to people who left the church because of his book? And the first thing he said is, well, I'd be heartbroken to hear that. But number two, I don't think that they necessarily read my book in the correct frame of mind. They were looking for reasons to leave the church already. They weren't leaving the book leaving the church because of my book.
There are people who've joined the church because of that book.
Right. It's an excellent book, and one that I'd recommend to everybody. So I don't know. I think that is an important thing, is there's so much more to most of these things than what meets the eye.
Let's draw the contrast here, right? In the CES letter, you have a person who's already decided what their views are, writing in this letter and acting as if they're a sincere seeker. And they give one side of the story. They make it seem like they know a lot more than they do. And then they make Richard Bushman appear to be their ally. They selectively quote, so it seems like he believes exactly what they believe. Then you have Richard Bushman, by far the best informed biographer of Joseph Smith, right? And he's not a hack. He has a Bancroft Prize. He's got like the World Series championship of being a historian.
Right.
Widely, Harvard educated, Columbia University emeritus professor.
And I think everybody who are members or not members of the church would agree that he's a great historian.
Yeah, that's the point here. Mm-hmm. He knows the historical method. And notice that he does an even-handed analysis of these accounts. He grants right off the bat, the accounts of Priesthood Restoration are not day of. You don't have a May 15th, 1829 videotape of John the Baptist ordaining Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. You don't even have a journal entry that day. So he grants, our evidence comes years later. That raises the possibility of fabrication, and then he evaluates that premise. He brings all of the evidence to bear, not just what he wants, not just the conclusion he's already determined. He knows the entire historical record, and he situates it in such a way where he says, if Joseph was fabricating, it looks like he did an awful job of it.
Right.
And so the conclusion Bushman comes to is, let's take Joseph Smith at his word. Let's have a hermeneutic of trust in him, not a hermeneutic of suspicion. Let's let him tell his own story and take him seriously. Bushman doesn't just by default believe everything Joseph ever says in the record. He does this. This is his method. He triangulates all of the claims. And it's just such a much better historical method. What the CES letter does is not a historical method. It's a hack. And so Bushman practices the historical method, and he practices it with faith and hope and charity, which is what we advocate here.
Right. And peacemaking. I think is a big part of it as well. Great. I think that much of what we've talked about is quite sufficient for these before 1832 accounts. What do you think? Anything else?
Yeah, notice that the earliest record in the historical record, as far as it relates to priesthood, is the 1832 autobiography. And on the first page, it asserts, I was ordained to priesthood by a ministering angel, and I was ordained to a high priesthood by ministering angels. This is... you could say, well, that's a late fabrication, or you could say, my goodness, the earliest piece of evidence we have affirms this. You get to decide how you're going to interpret that record.
Right.
And it tells more about the person interpreting than it does about the nature of the evidence, the way they decide to interpret it.
Right. With that, I guess one additional thing that Jeremy brings up in his letter is a quote from David Whitmer. And David Whitmer was one of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, and he said, I never heard that an angel ordained Joseph and Oliver to the Aaronic priesthood until the year 1834, 1835, or 1836 in Ohio. I do not believe that John the Baptist ever ordained Joseph and Oliver.
What an excellent point. Let's go slow, right? Let's slow down and let's listen to David Whitmer. I never heard that an angel ordained Joseph Smith until 1834, 5, or 6. Notice that his memory is vague. Do you have the date on that quote? It's a late statement.
I'm trying to look right now. Yeah. It looks like it's from 1885.
Okay. So this is when David is at the end of his life and he's defending himself as a witness.
Right.
He's very carefully situating himself as an absolute believer in the Book of Mormon, the coming forth of the Restoration, a witness of the Book of Mormon plates, and someone who lost his confidence in Joseph Smith in that 1834, 35, 36 window. Now, this is David. So here, notice first the irony. The CES letter is going to trust an 1885 memory of David Whitmer as if it's the gospel truth about an event that's, 40 years?
A while later.
A half century earlier. No, we're not going to question that at all. But if Joseph Smith gives us a account of being ordained by an angel 3 years after it happened, we're going to be suspicious of that.
Right.
That's the hermeneutic of suspicion, and that's the unevenness that you see in the CES letter. It doesn't apply the same standards of evaluation to all its sources. But there's every reason to take David seriously here. Now, what he says is, I never heard. Okay, that's different from saying, I absolutely positively know that no angels ever ordained Joseph Smith. It may very well be the case that David didn't know that angels ordained Joseph Smith until 1834, 5, or 6. That's entirely possible. It's also possible that he knew that earlier and that he's misremembering the years. He has motivation to do that.
And at this point, he's quite old.
Yes. Quite old. Now, I take that personally, Easton. Did you mean that as a personal attack on my memory?
Yep, exactly.
Okay. I take everything personally at this age. So David is in the process of recasting the past. He and Hiram Page and like-minded people, William McClellan, are working out their own narrative, right? They have, this the CES letter itself does this. That's where you tell a story about the past that situates you in it and it makes sense to you. It's the story you tell yourself about yourself. And so David Whitmer's version of this story is the church was absolutely true on April 6, 1830. My testimony of the Book of Mormon is absolutely true. In the mid-1830s, Joseph Smith lost his way. By the way, that's right after he said, I would be the leader of the church if he should not come back, right? David has a big motive, along with his brother-in-law, Hiram Page, and again, William McClellan and some others, to remember the past in a way that's self-serving. Remember the past in a way that they want it to be. And that is Joseph Smith becomes a fallen prophet in the mid-1830s. So we have to scrutinize David's evidence in the exact same way we scrutinize Joseph's. But you'll notice in the CES letter, we only scrutinize evidence if it's
from Joseph.
Yeah, and if it serves our already preconceived conclusion.
Right.
We don't scrutinize any evidence that may, we don't use the same standards for way late evidence from David Whitmer that we would from Joseph Smith.
Right. Okay, moving forward, I think these next three kind of go all together. So I'm trying to figure out exactly the best way to do it. But the subsections are backdating, absence in the Book of Commandments, and retrofitted. So I guess here's a good place is Reynolds. He says, had the restoration of the Aaronic priesthood under the hand of John the Baptist been recorded prior to 1833, it would have been expected to appear in the Book of Commandments.
It would have been expected to appear. That's hypothetical history.
It's an assumption.
Yeah. Had it happened in 1829, we would have expected to hear it in the 1833 Book of Commandments.
Right.
And because we don't, it proves that it didn't ever happen.
Right.
So Joseph made it up in 1832 or 38, 39. So let's imagine that if the Book of Commandments started with what's now section 13 of the Doctrine and Covenants. On May 15th, 1829, John the Baptist appeared, said, "Upon you, my fellow servants, I confer the priesthood of Aaron." If, let's say, the doctrine or the 1833 Book of Commandments did, do you think Jeremy would have a different conclusion? Do you think he would say, that does it. That's it.
That's the missing piece.
I'm back in. If there was a diary entry, early spring 1830, today I saw the Father and the Son in the grove. So the letter makes it appear like if there were just these pieces of evidence that are missing, if they were there, then the church will be true, but they're not there. So it's disingenuous in that sense as well, right? What are the other ones you pointed out there?
So the next two are retrofitted and backdating. Yeah.
So in other words, we decide that our early sources don't say words like Aaronic and Melchizedek. So later on, we add those in and we put those words in the mouth of John the Baptist and so forth.
Right.
And that proves that no angels ever ordained Joseph Smith. Well, maybe what it shows is that Joseph Smith understands more and more over time.
He learns.
Yeah. Maybe he gets line on line and precept on precept. That's as legitimate a interpretation of the evidence, isn't it? It's a hermeneutic of faith and hope and charity. We could choose that. There's no reason. People who know this evidence at least as well as Jeremy Reynolds, a lot of people, choose to interpret it faithfully.
Right.
And instead of calling it retrofitting, notice that every word he picks is a negatively connotated word. He always picks the negatively charged words. Retrofitted. What's the other one?
Backdating.
Backdated. Yeah. Backdated. So we make up evidence late and we say it happened early and we therefore can't be trusted. We're constantly lying, misrepresenting. That's his hermeneutic, or that's his choice about how to interpret the evidence, but it's not the evidence.
Right.
It's not the evidence itself.
I think moving forward, this next section might be, to me, one of the most important sections.
Great.
And that is ordination by Lyman Wight. Could you, before we dive into that, who in the world is Lyman Wight?
Lyman Wight is a fascinating character. He's one of the early converts in Ohio as the missionaries passed through there on their way to the far western frontier. He's one of many who joined the church. He's particularly zealous and faithful. He'll end up being ordained an apostle, but he ends up on his own in Texas with a kind of a offshoot group. But in the meantime, what they're talking about here is that in June 1831, at the Morley Farm in Ohio, Joseph Smith is ordained in some way or other by some fashion by Lyman Wight.
And at the same time, did Joseph Smith also ordain Lyman Wight, or had that happened before?
I'm not sure on that. That's a good question.
Sorry, keep going. I can find it real quick as we keep talking.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question.
So he was ordained an elder, so to the Melchizedek priesthood, by Oliver Cowdery, November 1830.
Okay, so say that again. Lyman Wight was ordained.
Lyman Wight was ordained as an elder by Oliver Cowdery 7 months before this in November 1830.
So notice that's when Oliver is very first passing through Ohio, and that's
Right.
on the tail end of his visit.
Mm-hmm.
So Lyman Wight is an early elder, and Joseph Smith will come the next winter. He'll arrive a couple of months later, and then in June, there's going to be a very important meeting. It's not really well documented, this June 1831 meeting, but the records we have say that there are manifestations of spiritual gifts. There are priesthood blessings, as we would say today, and that Joseph Smith reveals the high priesthood for the first time. Now, Marvin Hill and Richard Bushman and others, really well-informed historians, in other words, they have different interpretations of what this means. That's because, in part, the evidence is pretty thin. You got to interpret it. What does it mean, high priesthood? Is that Joseph revealing Melchizedek priesthood? Is it something else? Is it the office of high priest? All of these have been put forward. I'm right now pretty enamored with an interpretation of this that Dan Belknap and Mike McKay have written about. And that is, they're paying close attention to the idea of the priesthood being an order, a kind of community, a heavenly community. And they're tracing this idea all the way through. And when you do that, and when you try to put those glasses on and take off the glasses of 2024, this is how priesthood is organized. This is what a quorum is. These are the offices in the priesthood, and it's always been just like this, right? If you realize that in 1877, priesthood went through a massive reorganization, and other times too. If you realize that the way you and I talk about priesthood and office and so forth is not the way they were in 1830 and 31, that's what McKay and Belknap do. Then all of a sudden you can see other possibilities in what those records are describing. It may be that for the first time, Joseph's history is telling us, we came together in this order of priesthood, this community of saints that is going to fellowship with the church of the firstborn.
Right.
You and I don't tend to think of that when we think of priesthood, but that's what the early records seem to indicate. And so this is just another way of saying, slow down. A slowdown. I'm positive that neither me or Jeremy Runnels knows at a glance at these records what they mean. We haven't exhausted them. We could spend decades studying these records and coming to new insights and interpretations, or we could just foreclose all the possible interpretations by deciding, I know what it means, and I dismiss everything else. So different ways of thinking about this depending on how serious you are about knowing what these records mean.
Right. If you want to understand what's going on at this point, maybe go look at the actual record that's found here in the Joseph Smith papers on this June 4th or June 3rd, 1831 event.
That's where the best source material will be. Right. Everything else will be derivative of what's in there.
And still quite good. Richard Bushman is great, and we definitely need to look into it. But he's not the end-all, be-all. He can give a good perspective, but let's dive into the actual history.
That's a really great point, Easton. If you want to watch someone think slowly and analyze the evidence well and contextualize it with other evidence, read Bushman's biography and read it slowly and well and wisely. He's great at this. I don't necessarily agree with all the conclusions he comes to. That doesn't mean I know better. But you can't find a better model of how to think like a historian thinks and how to, take this evidence seriously, but all together, not bits and pieces, not just the parts that prove what I already decided.
Right. So I think to conclude this section, I just want to ask this final question. We've already talked about it, but I think it's a good thing just to re-ask this question. And this comes directly from the CES letter. If Peter, James, and John ordained
right? This is hypothetical history. If.
Yep.
Okay. Now that we're clear.
Okay. So if they had ordained Joseph Smith, and also there's a bit of a tone to that of, well, if it happened.
Right.
But if Peter, James, and John ordained Joseph Smith to the Melchizedek priesthood in 1829, why did Lyman White ordain Joseph Smith to the Melchizedek priesthood again in 1831?
Okay, so notice, first of all, we're doing hypothetical history. Second, notice that this sentence assumes it knows what Lyman White did and what Joseph Smith did.
Right.
I'm not I know this evidence well. I've studied it a lot. I've read lots of things about it. I'm not positive exactly what Lyman White was doing. So why in the world would the CES letter be the source that thinks it knows? If scholars, including Bushman and others, aren't quite exactly sure what that ordination to the high priesthood in June 1831 means, how in the world does the CES letter presume to know? So in other words, slow down. It's a good question if it were a real seeking question, right? The better way to ask it would be, what does the June 1831 ordination to the high priesthood mean relative to the other things that Joseph's histories say about priesthood? That's a seeker's question. And then you dig into that. You spend as much time as it takes doing all the hard work with both brain and spirit. And eventually you get to better answers like Dan Belknap and Mike McKay have done. They know this stuff well. They know it better than the CES letter does, and they've excavated it, and they've come up with a really pretty compelling answer. I don't know it as well as them, and I also don't want to sort of give away the ending, steal their well-deserved thunder. So I'll refer folks to the stuff they're publishing. But in other words, it's a good question if it were a real, sincere seeking question. And the ways to find the answer to it are not to just knee-jerk respond and say, therefore, no priesthood ordination by Peter, James, and John, but rather to come to understanding about what happened in June 1831.
Awesome. Steve, as we kind of begin to conclude here, we have one question from somebody on our Instagram that I'd just like to quickly ask. And the question is, what role does, quote, the chamber of old Father Whitmer, close quote, play in priesthood restoration?
This is an excellent question. The chamber of old Father Whitmer is a phrase from Joseph Smith's manuscript history. And that passage in his history tells that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery didn't know quite what they're supposed to do with priesthood. And so they sought and received a revelation. It simply means at the Whitmer home in Fayette, New York. The chamber of old Father Whitmer is a reference to in the Whitmer home, Fayette, New York, pre-April 6, 1830. And the gist of this revelation is to tell them how to organize the church, how to exercise the priesthood they've received to organize the church. What it tells them is they should not ordain each other apostles until they've gathered the baptized believers, had sacrament with them, received their common consent that Joseph be their first elder and Oliver the second, and then they should ordain themselves to those offices in the Savior's restored church. So this is the revelation that sets the table for what happens on April 6, 1830, there in the Whitmer home. Now, what we don't know well at all is what's the relationship of this revelation to ordination by Peter, James, and John as apostles and to the Melchizedek priesthood. Because Joseph's manuscript history has this big gap in it, this big hole, maybe, right? He clearly narrates the story of John the Baptist ordaining him. He gives the date. And then we go to this chamber of Father Whitmer revelation, and nowhere in the middle there or on either side is a narration of Peter, James, and John. So the question is wide open. What, if anything, where does that Peter, James, and John episode fit? And you have well-informed historians, Larry Porter, Richard Bushman, Marvin Hill, all coming to different conclusions about when and where and how the Peter, James, and John episode happens. Michael McKay has his own views on that. My personal, I tend to interpret it pretty conservatively, meaning I think there's a hole in the manuscript history. What I think happened is on May 15th, 1829, John the Baptist ordained Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, told them he was ministering under the direction of Peter, James, and John, who had more priesthood for them, and that at some future time they'd receive it. I think that future time is probably within the next month, and that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery are ordained by Peter, James, and John in relatively short order. I don't know that for positive certainty. Richard Bushman comes to a different conclusion than that. Larry Porter comes to that same conclusion. Marvin Hill puts a lot of emphasis on the June 1831 thing. So, faithful, believing, very well-informed scholars all come to different conclusions on this because the evidence is just too thin. We just don't know.
Right.
But I think it's likeliest that ordination comes in that window between John the Baptist and then Joseph and Oliver saying, Lord, now what do we do, right? We've never organized a church before. We don't know how this goes. What do we do? And that's the revelation in the Whitmer home that he refers to in his manuscript history.
Very good. Steve, as we conclude, I have one final question, and I think it's an important question.
Great.
You are a faithful Latter-day Saint. To this day, you've learned a lot more about the priesthood than most of our listeners have, looking through the Doctrine and Covenants and through the actual history of Joseph Smith and his journals and documents and everything like that. What does the priesthood mean to you?
Oh, wow. I was miraculously healed of a brain infection, an infection in the tissues around my brain in 1994 by a priesthood blessing. So I owe my life to it, but in some ways that's the least of what it means to me. I'll tell you that my father was really good, or let me say he became really good at obtaining power in the priesthood. He did that by not covering his sins, gratifying his pride or his vain ambitions. He did it by being gentle and meek and with unfeigned love, kindness, and pure knowledge, no hypocrisy and no guile. He didn't, he learned the one lesson that very few of us ever learn, right? You can hear me echoing Doctrine and Covenants 121. The best advice, information, revelation I have ever received, the world maybe has ever received, is in Doctrine and Covenants 121. If Joseph Smith is not inspired of Almighty God, then where in the world did that text come from? Because almost every problem that we have, men dominating women or other men, men being bad. Those problems are solved when men listen to that text that Joseph composed in the jail at Liberty, Missouri, and act on it, right? That would solve lots of problems. And in my life, it solves problems. I am a much better father. I've got that text in my head because I desperately need it. I am the natural man when I do not follow what Doctrine and Covenants 121 says about obtaining power in the priesthood. And I'm awful. I'm a terrible person, a tyrant. I immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion, hypocrisy, guile, feigned love, covering sins, gratifying pride. All I'm worried about is my vain ambition. But when I remember priesthood, then I become a different creature, meek. I follow those beautiful, beautiful words between verses about 34 and 46 of Doctrine and Covenants 121. That's what the priesthood means to me, Easton. It's not about office so much. Offices come and go. You serve. All right. I was recently released as a bishop. That's over. Those keys have been handed to someone else. That office belongs to someone else. Those things aren't permanent. What's permanent is confidence in God's presence and the relationships that you forge by being sealed into covenants that are mediated by priesthood. So this is all another way of saying priesthood to me is not confined to men. President Oaks admonished us not to equate men with priesthood. We do this. We do this badly often. We use the word priesthood and men as if they are the same thing, if they're synonymous.
Or we use priesthood just to mean priesthood offices so often.
Right.
So much more than all of that.
Wow, it is bigger and deeper than that, isn't it? Priesthood is the power of Almighty God. Or we might say priesthood is the power of our heavenly parents. And they are interested in endowing all of us with all of it. I don't know how that works, but it's not like pizza. Doctrine and Covenants 109 talks about an infinity of fullness, suggesting that all of us could inherit all of their power and not diminish them in the least. In fact, that's their glory. That's their exaltation. So I am interested in seeking and acquiring that kind of power. The only way it can be done is by meekness, gentleness, long-suffering, unfeigned love, kindness, pure knowledge, not this pretension to knowledge that we fight ourselves and so many of us wrestle with. So priesthood is, I would say, the most powerful determinant of my life. The desire to acquire that power to bless myself and my posterity forever. That's the most powerful driver of my life. Priesthood is everything.
Amen. Wow. Well, Steve, thank you very much for joining us here today and talking about priesthood restoration. We appreciate all of your knowledge and expertise. As always, to those who are listening, we want to invite and welcome you to continue your study by going to the show notes, by going to the description where we have multiple articles and even books linked that you can go and further your study at. If you really want to know the truth, take the time, take the effort to actually learn the truth. So we thank you so much for listening. We invite you to share this with your friends, any truth seekers in your life, and we'll talk to you next time.